Looking for magic cards? At flipsidegaming.com you can now use the promo code LVD to get a 10% discount on orders over $10 while supporting the channel at the same time. Hello and welcome to another episode of Friendly Friday, a weekly series where we take a look at budget, standard or modern decks, and this week we're taking a look at Blue-White Ironworks in Modern. This is an artifact-based combo deck that revolves around the 4-mana artifact Krark-Clan Ironworks, which is both a sacrifice outlet for artifacts and also a mana engine. So the basic premise of the deck is to try and get an Ironworks into play. Then this entire middle row of cards here are all artifacts that you can sacrifice to draw cards with. So by having an Ironworks into play, you can sacrifice all these artifacts to generate mana and draw cards at the same time. And then we have 8 different cards here, Faith's Reward and Open the Vaults, which can return all artifacts from your graveyard back into play, where you can once again sacrifice them to draw cards and generate more mana with your Ironworks. And then at some point we'll have a lot of mana to cast a giant Banefire to kill the opponent with. And then in the sideboard we can switch it up by casting an Emrakul instead. So let's take a look at the entire list, starting out with a very important card, which is Lotus Bloom, a black lotus with suspend 3, so you can't actually cast it from your hand, but instead you have to suspend it and wait 3 turns before you get to cast your black lotus. But once you do, it provides 3 mana of any color when you sacrifice it, which is very important as your Open the Vaults and Faith's Reward can also get it back once you sacrifice it. Then we have a whole bunch of trinkets which we can sacrifice to draw cards. We've got Chromatic Sphere and Chromatic Star, which are subtly different in that the Chromatic Sphere draws you a card when you use the ability, while Chromatic Star draws you a card when it goes to the graveyard, meaning that if you sacrifice Chromatic Star to your Ironworks, you still get to draw a card, while if you sacrifice Chromatic Sphere to an Ironworks, you don't get to draw the card. Then you have Conjurer's Bauble, which you can just sacrifice to draw a card and put a card from your graveyard on the bottom of your library, which can be relevant if the opponent makes you discard your only win condition like Banefire. So by putting the Banefire back on the bottom of your library, eventually you'll get to draw it again. Then we have 4 copies of Implement of Improvement, which is a 1-mana artifact. You can pay a white to sacrifice the implement to gain 2 life, and whenever the implement goes to the graveyard from the battlefield, you get to draw a card. So if you sacrifice it to the Ironworks, you still get to draw a card besides getting 2 colorless mana. Same goes with Terrarion, which is a 1-mana artifact that enters battlefield tapped. You can pay 2 mana, sacrifice it, and make 2 mana of any color. And when the Terrarion goes to the graveyard from the battlefield, you get to draw a card. So you also get to draw a card if you sacrifice it to the Ironworks. And finally, we have 4 copies of Ichor Wellspring, which is a 2-mana artifact that draws you a card when it enters a battlefield, but also when it goes to the graveyard from the battlefield. So with an Ironworks in play, this becomes a free draw 2 cards, which is a very powerful effect. Then of course we have our Ironworks, which you can also sacrifice to itself, which is relevant when you're going to cast a Faith's Reward or Open the Vaults, just to get 2 free mana. Then we get to our white cards that return our artifacts from the graveyard back into play, but they work slightly differently in that Faith's Reward is a 4-mana instant that only returns permanents that were put from the battlefield into our graveyard this turn, so there is a time restriction there. While Open the Vaults returns all artifacts and enchantment cards from all graveyards to the battlefield under their owner's control, which means that this also returns the opponent's stuff from their graveyard back into play. But of course the advantage here is that if you've sacrificed some artifacts at the start of the game, you'll get those back as well with Open the Vaults, while with Faith's Reward there is a time restriction. Then our win condition is a Banefire, which is uncounterable, and if our opponent does happen to discard it, of course we've got our Conjurer's Bauble to put it back into our deck. And then the final piece of the puzzle is Reshape, a blue sorcery that costs X and double blue. As an additional cost to cast Reshape, you have to sacrifice an artifact, which is not a problem. And then you get to search your library for an artifact card with converted mana cost X or less and put it onto the battlefield. So the obvious combo with Reshape is that for just 2 mana you can go get a Lotus Bloom, since the converted mana cost of Lotus Bloom is 0. So you just have to pay 2 mana, sacrifice an artifact to go get a Lotus Bloom, which is very important to generate more mana. And if you have more mana at your disposal, you can just pay 4 for the X and go get an Ironworks to get things started. Then quickly going over the mana base, we have 4 copies of Adarkar Wastes, which taps for both blue and white mana, but most of the time we're just gonna tap it for colorless mana, so it doesn't cost us any life. Then we have 4 copies of Darksteel Citadel, which is an indestructible artifact land, so we can sacrifice it to Ironworks to produce mana, we can sacrifice it to Reshape, for example, and we can also use our Ghost Quarter, which is our next card, and target our own Darksteel Citadel, which is indestructible, to go get a basic land, since Faith's Reward returns all permanents from our graveyard back into play. So if you can Ghost Quarter your own Darksteel Citadel, for example, you can go get more and more basics whenever you cast Faith's Reward to get them all back. And of course, sometimes you can just use Ghost Quarter on the opponent's lands to disrupt them a bit, which is one of the few ways to interact with the opponent in game 1. And then of course we have some basics to also go get with our Ghost Quarter, 4 islands and 1 plains. Then going over the sideboard, one of the key cards that we have to keep in mind are enchantments like Stony Silence, which completely shuts down our deck, as well as graveyard hate cards like Rest in Peace or Relic of Progenitus. So our sideboard is mostly geared towards protecting our own combo and dealing with hate cards, more than trying to slow down the opponent's game plan. So that's why we have 2 copies of Erase to exile target enchantment, which deals with Stony Silence and Rest in Peace. Then we have 2 copies of Silence and 2 copies of Defense Grid against counterspell heavy decks, where we can also bring in 2 copies of Swan Song, which does double duty, countering instants and sorceries, but also enchantments, so it can counter Stony Silence or Rest in Peace. But then we have to keep in mind that if we cast an Open the Vaults, the opponent might get those enchantments back, which is why just exiling or bouncing the opponent's enchantments is better. And that's why we have 3 copies of Echoing Truth, which can return target non-land permanent and all permanents with the same name to the opponent's hand, so that can counter any hate cards that the opponent might have. We also have a Pithing Needle, which can name cards like Nihil Spellbomb or Relic of Progenitus to shut them down. Then we have 2 copies of Filigree Familiar against burn decks, gaining some life and drawing a card when it dies, so when we sacrifice it to the Ironworks, we also get to draw a card. And then finally we have 1 Emrakul as an additional win condition, and we can just swap it for our Banefire in matchups where we expect our opponent to have brought in cards like Leyline of Sanctity to stop our Banefire, and we don't want to bring in our Echoing Truth to bounce those Leylines. Instead we can just try and kill them with Emrakul. And the main reason to play Banefire in the main deck instead of Emrakul is that against Ensnaring Bridge you don't want to have Emrakul as your only win condition, because otherwise you might not be able to win. So that's the deck. Now let's jump into some games and see how the deck does. Alright, we're on the draw and we have an opening hand with Lotus Bloom, which you almost always want to keep, and 2 lands is also fine, so we'll keep. And hopefully our opponent isn't too fast or too disruptive. Although Sparbluff Canal might mean Storm, which is not a great sign. Opponent passes. Alright, Reshape can either get an Ironworks or another Lotus Bloom, so let's suspend our first Lotus Bloom, play out an island, and I guess we can run out a Terrarion here. Opponent has an opt-in response, so could still be a Storm deck, could also be maybe a Blue-Red or Jeskai Snapcaster deck. Alright, our opponent passes on turn 2, so no mana dork from Storm, which is good, so either our opponent isn't Storm or they're missing their mana dork. So here we have the option of running out Ichor Wellspring, or we can run out 2 1-mana trinkets. We could also technically Reshape, sacrificing the Citadel, but I don't want to do that here. So I think, given that our opponent might be holding counterspells, I would rather play 2 1-mana artifacts rather than the 1 2-mana artifact. So let's start by playing out another Terrarion. Opponent's gonna Spell Stutter Sprite it. Alright, interesting, so opponent on Blue-Red Fairies. So the Sprite will counter the Terrarion here, and then we'll run out the Chromatic Sphere. So had we played out Ichor Wellspring, our opponent would not have been able to counter that with the Spell Stutter Sprite. And Spell Stutter Sprite can also counter our Lotus Bloom, which is quite scary, since we really need our Lotus Bloom to win the game. A counterspell heavy deck is going to be a difficult one to beat, so we'll see how this game progresses. Our Lotus Bloom will come off of suspend next turn, and finding a land here is good. Don't mind running out Ichor Wellspring here. See if our opponent has a second Spellstutter Sprite they want to use. Alright, we get to draw our card, and there's the Ironworks, excellent. So Let's run out the Bauble as well. And the reason I'm not sacrificing any of our trinkets yet is that we want to try and set up a turn where we can play the Ironworks and sacrifice all these artifacts in the same turn in case we draw Faith's Reward, so we can get them all back. And as long as we're hitting land drops, there's no real reason to sacrifice any artifacts yet. Alright, our opponent has a second Spellsetter Sprite, so that's going to counter our Bauble. But I'm happy that our opponent is firing off these sprites now rather than countering our Lotus Bloom. Could be that our opponent has a counter for that as well. So next turn, Lotus Bloom comes off of spend. We'll have 6 mana, so that means we get to run out an Ironworks and start sacrificing a whole bunch of stuff. And then hopefully we draw into a Faith's Reward or open the vaults. Opponent bolts us end of turn. So the opponent definitely on the tempo plan of countering our stuff and trying to kill us quickly. So the sprites come in, we fall to 14, and let's see what happens to our Lotus Bloom. Let's cast it. Opponent lets it resolve, we draw a Conjurer's Bauble for the turn. So we could Reshape to try and bait a counterspell from the opponent, and that way we get another Lotus Bloom, which is still fine. And if our opponent counters this, then we can still resolve the Ironworks. And if our opponent doesn't, then we'll have to reconsider our options. So let's Reshape, paying 2 blue, and sacrificing our Wellspring. Opponent's gonna fetch in response. So let's see if they have a counterspell for this. Alright, opponent counters draw, that's good. So now we have the opportunity to resolve our Ironworks. So let's get this into play, and I'm just gonna start sacrificing stuff right away in the hopes of finding one of our ways of getting our stuff back. And there we go, Faith's Reward. That should have things covered, so we can run out our implements, sacrifice that. Then we can run out another implement, sacrifice that to draw a card. Lotus Bloom doesn't do much here, but that's fine. So let's sacrifice the Sphere for white mana. And Ichor Wellspring is a free draw too. And now we're just going off, so I think we're pretty easily gonna win this game here. So let's run out the Bauble as well. We'll sacrifice that just to make mana since we've already found our Banefire. Sacrifice that, sacrifice the Ironworks itself. And now we can Faith's Reward, get everything back, and start making more and more mana here. Alright, and our opponent scoops it up, so they haven't even seen our Banefire. So let's go to sideboarding against a Jeskai counterspell heavy deck. So I think we want our defense grid. I think we want our Swan Song. And our opponent might also have some graveyard hate cards. Not sure what those might be. And I think we want Banefire over Emrakul in this matchup. Opponent also pretty likely to have Stony Silence, since we did see them playing white. So we should probably bring in our Erase. And Silence could also be an option, although at that point we're starting to sideboard a lot of cards, and this is a pretty lean deck where you can't really afford to side in a whole bunch of cards. So what do we take out? I think we can definitely shave a Conjurer's Bauble, and then the least important trinkets are probably cards like Terrarion. And then we can probably shave some Reshapes as well, which aren't great against counterspells, and maybe an implement. So let's try this configuration. And this opening hand is great, but of course it can be the Stony Silence on turn 2, but I think we still keep. Opponent just says go. Alright, Faith's Reward, that's good. So let's run out an implement. Opponent bolts us. and suspend Lotus Bloom. Say go. Opponent just passes. Let's run out the Wellspring. Can't get countered by Spellstutter Sprite, which is nice. And Adarkar Wastes is also a nice pickup, since that lets us sacrifice the Implement if we want to. So our opponent's probably saving their counter spells to counter this Lotus Bloom, which is fine. Think we'll just run out the Adarkar Wastes and sacrifice the Implements. Alright, find a Chromatic Sphere, which is good. Let's see if our opponent wants to counter this one. They don't. Let's just pass a turn and keep the sphere in play for now. So we've got multiple Ironworks that the opponent has to deal with, and they haven't presented a clock yet. They might maybe Snapcaster Boltus end of turn to start beating down. Alright, there's a Snapcaster. So we're down to 15. And now the opponent's counter spells gain a lot of value as our opponent starts beating us down every turn. Search for Ascanta, interesting, so they're tapping pretty low here on a pretty critical turn where our Lotus Bloom comes off of suspend. Opponent might have a Ceremonious Rejection at the ready. So let's see what they do about Lotus Bloom. They let it resolve. Alright, I think we're just going for Ironworks here. Alright, that resolves, so let's sacrifice the Wellspring, which is a pretty free one to sacrifice. Let's go ahead and sacrifice this for white mana. Find another Faith's Reward. Alright, so now we can generate 9 mana, so we should be able to double Faith's Reward here. So that's nice. Run out a star. Sacrifice that. Run out another star, which keeps adding 1 mana and drawing us a card. Let's sacrifice this for white. And I think we can just go all in here since we have the backup Faith's Reward in case our opponent has a counterspell. Sacrifice this to itself. Could also try and play another Ironworks, but I won't have enough mana to play both Faith's Reward here. So let's do this instead. Faith's Reward. And alright, our opponent scoops it up, so they didn't have any interaction for our combo, and we were just gonna go off here, draw our entire deck, eventually find a Banefire, make some red mana, and kill the opponent. Sweet, on to the next one. Alright, we're on the draw here with a pretty land-heavy hand that doesn't have a ton of action, so let's go to 6. Well, this one has some action, but no lands. So we're on the draw, we get a Scry. How does this hand look even if we hit a land drop? Still not great since we don't have Lotus Bloom. And Reshape for Ironworks is pretty pricey, as well as these Open a Vault, so I don't think this hand is gonna get there. Alright, this is much better. Let's keep. And Implement we can put on the bottom since we wanna hit land drops. So we've got Lotus Bloom, Faith's Reward and some trinkets. And our opponent with a Bird's turn 1. It's generally a good sign. So let's run out Citadel, run out Chromatic Sphere. And I typically like running out the sphere before the star, since sacrificing the sphere to itself is just fine, since you get to draw the card and make a mana, but sacrificing the star to the Ironworks is much better, since you still get to draw the card, as well as making 2 colorless mana. So saving the star for later when you have an Ironworks online is typically better. Voice of Resurgence, yeah, that's just a 2/2. So Lotus Bloom ticks down, and we find another Lotus Bloom. Alright, that's pretty good as well. And given that our recursion card is a Faith's Reward, we might want to wait with sacrificing our trinkets here, since otherwise we might not get anything back. So let's just say go. So we will have a lot of mana at our disposal, we just need to make sure that we draw enough cards afterwards. But if our opponent is just a creature deck, they might give us enough time to set up here. And if the opponent's interaction is Path to Exile and Ghost Quarters, then we're in a decent spot. So opponent's Ghost Quarters are Adarkar Wastes. I guess we'll float a colorless, but that doesn't really matter. And we'll go get, I guess, an island, since I want to keep the planes in our deck in case we want to fetch it later. We're not going to use our mana though. Untap. So next turn we'll have one Lotus Bloom, and we picked up another Ghost Quarter. That's nice. I'm not going to Ghost Quarter the opponent, but just hitting our land drops is good, since at some point we can Ghost Quarter ourselves to get additional lands. Opponent might sacrifice a Canopy end of turn, and they do. So they're looking for action as well. Courser of Krufix, that's fine. Opponent hits us for 3 again. So let's cast Lotus Bloom. Find another Ghost Quarter. So we're starting to draw quite a few lands here, which isn't great. I think I'm just gonna run out the Ghost Quarter, say go. And the plan here is to try and wait as long as possible before we start going off with our Faith Reward, since every additional draw step means potentially more draw steps in the turn we're going off. So we want to try and delay that turn as long as possible. Opponent can hit us for at least 4 here. They might play a big creature here. Ramunap Excavator. So they're gonna start Ghost Quartering our lands as well. Nope, they're gonna go for the Canopy. So they wanna draw more cards themselves. At some point we're gonna run out of basics, so we do need to keep that in mind. So for now we'll just take 4. Get a second Lotus Bloom. Alright, Terrarion is a good one. So I think we can afford to wait one more turn here. So let's run out a Terrarion, since we're only scheduled to take 6 here. I guess if our opponent plays a Gavony Township, we could be in trouble. But right now we only would get 4 total draws between the Sphere twice and the Star twice, since we can't sacrifice the Terrarion quite yet. And I'm not sure that with 4 draws we're gonna get there. So I think we just have to say go once more and give ourselves a few extra draws by being able to sacrifice our Terrarion. Opponent sacrificing the Canopy end of turn, so that decreases the chances that we get killed by a Gavony Township here. Opponent with another Courser, alright, so that's fine. So we will get to go off next turn, hopefully. Opponent hits us for 6, down to 4. And Island the draw, not great. So let's get things started. Sacrifice this for double white. Alright, Ironworks is good. So let's sacrifice this for white. Ghost Quarter our own Citadel. Go get a Plains. Run out Ironworks. Sacrifice a Star. Another Faith Reward. Alright, so now I think we have it. So let's sacrifice this for white. To draw a card. Reshape is nice as well. So we can sack this for blue. Reshape. Which can get us another Lotus. Sacrifice this. Get a Lotus Bloom. Sacrifice this for white. Sacrifice Ironworks to itself. Cast Faith Reward. Get everything back. So let's Ghost Quarter our own Citadel first to thin out the deck of lands. Then we'll sacrifice Chromatic Star. Alright, Ichor Wellspring is a nice one. So now we've got a nice draw engine going. And we still haven't played a land for the turn. Sphere, and we'll sacrifice this to its own ability to make sure that we get to draw a card. Another Wellspring. Alright, I don't think we can fizzle anymore. So now we just need to find our Banefire. There we go. So now we can just make some mana. And cast a giant Banefire on our opponent. Alright, there we go. So game 1 goes our way, despite a mulligan to 5. So things will get trickier after sideboard. So our opponent could have Stony Silence after sideboard, but they are a company deck, so they could have all creatures in the sideboard, including Reclamation Sages. So not sure that we need the erase. Not much we can do about Reclamation Sage in the sideboard. So the question is, do they have Stony Silence or Rest in Peace? If they do, then we probably want the erase. And I'm just gonna hedge and bring in an Echoing Truth as well. And then what do we take out? Don't mind shaving a Bauble. And I think I'm gonna switch up the Wincon as well, since our opponent has seen the Banefire. And then we'll take out a Terrarion and an Implement and try this. Could have also considered Pithing Needle perhaps for Scavenging Ooze. That's something I didn't consider. And that could be a mistake here, since Scavenging Ooze does mess with our plan, but this hand is quite good, so we'll keep. We've got a Lotus Bloom that we can suspend, Wellspring, 2 lands, and an erase in case of Stony Silence or Rest in Peace, so let's suspend Lotus Bloom, say go. And there's a Stony Silence, alright, so feeling pretty good about this sideboarded erase. And a Birds. Well, we could exile this right now, and I think we have to, since otherwise this doesn't tap for mana, so let's just get rid of it. Alright, Echoing Truth as well. I think we still just run out the Wellspring here. Get the card flow going. Alright, let's suspend another Lotus Bloom, say go. And hope our opponent doesn't have another hate card. Rest in Peace is more beatable than Stony Silence from this position, but I don't want to see either. And their opponent might have kept a slightly sketchy hand on the strength of Stony Silence, so hopefully that's the case and their hand isn't great. Alright, they're sacrificing the Canopy, that's good news. And Voice, that's fine. So far so good. Still do need to find some action, since we don't have a lot of card draw to go with our mana from Lotus Bloom. Alright, another erase, so we have drawn all our sideboard cards here. And of course now I wish these were additional trinkets, but if Stony Silence was still in play, there's no way we can win the game, so still happy about our sideboard plan here. Not much we can do here, I think, so let's just say go. And wait on these Lotus Blooms, which can help us reshape for an Ironworks. And then we'll have plenty of mana, but still no trinkets to sacrifice, really. Another Voice. So now we want to make sure not to Echoing Truth or erase anything during the opponent's turn, since otherwise they get very large elemental tokens. So we get to cast 1 Lotus Bloom. And we drew an Ironworks for the turn. Interesting, so could just run out the Ironworks and then also Echoing Truth the Voice of Resurgence, which buys us a lot of time. I think I like that. So let's sack this for blue and run out Ironworks. Could also Reshape to go get something cheap, since we could sacrifice the Wellspring here. But I don't want to go all in and put everything in our graveyard yet, in case our opponent does play a graveyard hate card next turn. So let's just Echoing Truth the Voice, and then we'll see what we do next turn. So let's just pause a turn for now. Alright, to just replay a Voice. And here we do have Open Vaults instead of Faith's Reward, so the things we sacrificed earlier still come back. So let's go get an island. Opponent hits us for 1. Cast another Lotus Bloom. And draw land for the turn, so got a lot of colorless mana at our disposal. This can make blue, which gives us blue for Reshape. So I think we need to Reshape for something that draws us cards, which I guess is a Wellspring, which draws the most. So we can Reshape for 2, and that still leaves us with plenty of mana, so let's go for it. And we can sacrifice a Wellspring here. So let's go get another Ichor Wellspring. And now we just need to find a second Open the Vaults effect to ensure that we can keep going off here. So let's sack Wellspring. Alright, drawing these Lotus Blooms isn't great, but I think we can still manage. So let's run out Chromatic Sphere. Sack this for white. Find a Reshape. Interesting, so kind of have to sacrifice this for white. Sacrifice our 2 Citadels, which are artifacts, so they will come back from the Open Vaults. Sacrifice this to itself. Cast Open Vaults. And our opponent concedes. Awesome, so let's see, how many cards were we going to draw here? We had 2 Ichor Wellsprings, which is a total of 4 cards. We had a Chromatic Sphere, which draws us 1 more card. And we can Reshape, since we have plenty of mana from the Lotus Bloom, to try and find another trinket perhaps. So I'm pretty confident that we would have been able to go off here, but there was definitely a small fail rate, so in a more competitive setting our opponent would not have conceded yet. Alright, on to the next one. Alright, we're on the play, and this hand is definitely a keep. Double Lotus Bloom on the play is pretty powerful. We do only have 1 land, but we do have 2 trinkets which we can sacrifice, so I think a solid keep overall. And the fact that these come off of Suspend in the same turn means that they're quite good in combination with Faith's Reward. So let's run out Chromatic Sphere and say go. Let's see what our opponent is up to. Darksteel Citadel, so this could be Affinity, yep, Signal Pest. Well, this is gonna be a race, and luckily we were on the play. So we might be able to kill our opponent on turn 4 here when the Lotus Blooms come off of Suspend. So we have to hope our opponent doesn't kill us before that. So we have an interesting decision here, since we kind of want to keep as many artifacts as possible for the turn we go off with Faith's Reward. But we also want to hit land drop, so I think we do have to sacrifice this Chromatic Sphere for white. Find another Chromatic Sphere, which we might as well play here. And say go. So didn't find our second land, but I think we are still in an okay spot. Although Cranial Plating with double Citadels is pretty scary. Opponent does only hit us for 1 here, but that's not gonna stay that way for very long. Found a Chromatic Star, so let's do the same as last turn, try and hit land drops. Alright, that's good. Go Scorer. And I guess we run out Star, and then run out an Implement as well. And then next turn we can sacrifice them in the same turn that we cast Faith's Reward to get them back. Arcbound Ravager, and they're gonna equip onto Ornithopter, so they can hit us for 7 at the very least. And next turn we might be dead, so we kind of have to go off here. So our 2 Lotus Blooms come off of Suspend. Cast Lotus Bloom. Cast Lotus Bloom. And what's our draw? An Ironworks, perfect. So we can make a ton of mana now. So let's make some colorless. We could Ghost Quarter our own Citadel, so I'm gonna keep that option open. Let's make white mana. Run out Ironworks. Otherwise we would have had to reshape for an Ironworks, which would have been a little more expensive. So we should be able to pretty cleanly go off here. So let's start by Ghost Quartering our own Citadel. I guess we go get a plane since we can sacrifice Bloom for blue mana if we want to now. That way we can reshape for another Lotus Bloom. Sacrifice our Chromatic Star. Sacrifice Implements. Haven't played a land yet, so let's play out Ghost Quarter. Run out another Implement. Sacrifice that as well. Another Faith's Reward, alright, so that should lock things up. So let's float a white mana. Ghost Quarter ourselves. Go get an island. Sacrifice this for white. Sacrifice Ironworks to itself. Faith's Reward. Get everything back. And we have a second Faith's Reward to go with it. So let's Ghost Quarter first to thin the lands out of our deck. Then we can start sacrificing our draw spells. Open the Vaults is another nice one. Let's put a Fate's Reward back on the bottom. Alright, we found our Banefire, so let's put our opponent out of their misery. That should be enough. Alright, sweet, managed to beat Affinity. So let's go on to sideboarding, where things get a little bit trickier, so our opponent could get some disruption here after sideboard. Think we still keep in the Banefire rather than the Emrakul. Don't think we want Familiar. I think Pithing Needle makes sense, since our opponent could also have Relic of Progenitus. I could see an argument for Echoing Truth as well, as an additional way to maybe bounce a disruptive element. So let's shave a Conjurer's Bauble and I guess an Implement. Alright, this hand's interesting. So We have most of our pieces, but we're missing some lands, and Terrarion we can't really sacrifice by itself. So this is a very close one. It could go either way, but I think we go to 6. And yeah, this one's missing the Lotus Bloom, but I think I like it. And Chromatic Sphere can go to the bottom. It's always difficult to mulligan a hand with a Lotus Bloom in it. Opponent with Springleaf Drum into Memnite, into Hope of Ghirapur. So that's a potential disruptive element from the opponent. And there we go, Lotus Bloom on turn 1, like we drew it up. This Hope of Ghirapur is going to make things tricky the turn we're trying to play out our Lotus Bloom. So do have to keep that in mind. So let's just lead with a Chromatic Sphere here. And say go. I guess we could have also played the Terrarion, but it's probably not going to make a huge difference. Arcbound Ravager, alright, so we take 2 here. Lotus Bloom ticks down. So we might be a turn too slow here, even with Lotus Bloom coming down, and especially with this Hope of Ghirapur making things tricky. For now I think I'm just happy running out Terrarion and Chromatic Star. Opponent could technically also have a Rest in Peace in their sideboard, which would of course be a pretty big problem for us. Looks like our opponent has a Thoughtseize here, which is gonna see 2 open vaults, so not the most effective Thoughtseize. There was also reason to play out our trinkets before sacrificing them in case our opponent did have a Thoughtseize. That way they couldn't take something like an Ironworks. Opponent's just gonna animate their Nexus, hit us for at least 3. Could use Ghost Quarter on the Nexus, but we kind of want to keep our land here. Alright, another Terrarion to draw. So, given that our payoff card is Open the Vaults and not Fate's Reward, I'm okay sacrificing some of our trinkets. So let's sacrifice a Sphere, sacrifice a Star, find an Ichor Wellspring. So we could run that out. So let's sacrifice Terrarion, try and hit our land drops here. Instead we find a Star. I guess we run out the Star over the Wellspring here, since we can sacrifice that. Find another Open the Vaults and run out the Terrarion. Alright, say go. So didn't do a whole lot this turn besides sacrificing a bunch of trinkets. So we kind of need to find some action soon here. Next turn our Lotus Bloom comes off of Suspend, so we'll have some additional mana. But we are taking a beating here. Opponent hits us for 4. Let's see if they sacrifice the Hope of Ghirapur or not. They do. So Lotus Bloom comes off of Suspend, but we can't actually cast it. So it stays exiled. So let's run out Ghost Quarter, sacrifice Terrarion. And there's a Fate's Reward. Can't cast any of our spells here, so we'll just have to say go. I guess we could have left our Terrarion in play rather than sacrificing it, since we couldn't cast any spells anyways. Opponent's gonna animate the Blink Moth, and looks like they're gonna start sacrificing some stuff. They can't deal lethal yet unless they have a Galvanic Blast, but even then they're a few points short. I think we need to save our Ghost Quarter here, since even if we kill this, opponent can just sacrifice it to the Ravager and we're still dead next turn. I think we just need to take the damage here. And our Lotus Bloom is gonna stay exiled, so we won't get that back. So yeah, that Hope of Ghirapur was quite effective here. Banefire doesn't really do much here, so I think we're just dead. I guess we can draw into one of our bounce spells as an out. So let's run out Chromatic Star. Make blue mana, find a Ghost Quarter. So yeah, I think we're just dead here. And there's another Lotus Bloom, but that's too late. Alright, so let's go to game 3 here against Affinity. Can we do anything about Hope of Ghirapur? Well, we did bring in our Pithing Needle, so that's a way to go around it. Other than that, I don't think there's anything we can really do. More Echoing Truths could be an option, but I think we just run this version back and hope to dodge the almighty Hope of Girapur. We would like to be on the play. And this hand's interesting, so we do have our Ironworks, no Lotus Blooms, but do have 2 spheres. I think this is probably a keep. Can't always have Lotus Bloom in your opener. So let's lead with Chromatic Sphere, say go. And our payoff is Open Vaults, so we could sacrifice these artifacts right away. Alright, Reshape is a nice one, so that can get a Lotus Bloom. This turn we can sacrifice this, make a blue plain island and sacrifice a Citadel, but I kind of want to avoid sacrificing the Citadel this early when we kind of need the mana. So I think we just run out Star and not sacrifice anything quite yet. And then next turn we can Reshape, sacrificing the Star. I think I like that more, so let's just say go. Opponent did not play anything turn 1, so they might have kept a payoff heavy hand or a hand with a lot of disruptive elements. Since if our opponent plays something like Relic of Progenitus here, then we want to be able to Reshape for a Pithing Needle. Opponent just animates the Blink Moth, so they want to Thoughtseize us here. Alright, that's fair. So they get to take one of our 3 cards, and they're all pretty important here. So whatever they take is gonna slow us down significantly. My own inclination is towards taking the Ironworks here, but I'm not sure how familiar our opponent is with our deck, and yeah, they're just gonna take the Ironworks as well. Alright, so our opponent did have the Thoughtseize, but they haven't presented a threat yet. Implement is an okay draw here. When we do cast Open Vaults, we do get our Ironworks back. So we could still Reshape for Lotus Bloom here if we want to. And then next turn we'll have enough mana to open the vaults. I think I like that actually. So let's sacrifice this for blue. Find a Wellspring, which is also decent. Let's Reshape, sacrifice Chromatic Star, draw Citadel, that's good. Get a Lotus Bloom, and then we can run out the Citadel, I think, over the plains and run out the Implement. And say go. Hope our opponent doesn't have an Ancient Grudge. Opponent with another Blink Moth. And a Signal Pest, that's fine. Do they have another Thoughtseize effect? Nope, just a Springleaf Drum. Do they keep up a mana here, or do they tap out? Vandal Blast instead to kill our Lotus Bloom, so might as well sacrifice it for white. And sacrifice this to draw a card and gain 2. There's a Fate's Reward, which isn't gonna be great here, unless we can open the vaults first. So our opponent did indeed keep a pretty disruption heavy hand. Terrarion is fine, so let's run out Wellspring. Find a Ghost Corridor. Alright, so we're slowly getting to our open the vaults here, so let's run out Terrarion. Run out Ghost Corridor. Say go. So we can keep Terrarion to generate double white for open the vaults. So we just need to dodge a Graveyard Hate card from the opponent here, or a counter spell or hand disruption spell. But most of those are all one-offs in the opponent's sideboard. They've already used Thoughtseize and Vandal Blast. They could still have some Graveyard Hate. Master of Ethereum. Alright, that's a pretty sizable threat. And another Thoughtseize, that's unfortunate, so my guess is that takes open the vaults, but I'm hoping our opponent takes the Fate's Reward instead. If at any point we find an Ironworks, I do like our chances here. Alright, our opponent does indeed take the open the vaults, so their Thoughtseizes have been pretty good here. Ghost Corridor to draw. I don't think this Fate's Reward is doing much for us at the moment. So let's just play the plains and say go. And then we have to hope to draw into another open the vaults, an Ironworks, even a Reshape would be pretty decent. Our Bound Ravager, that's scary, so we do have a Ghost Corridor in case they go all in on one of their creature lands. And they are indeed activating Inkmoth Nexus. But our opponent is now empty-handed, which is good news. Opponent is gonna hit us with 4 Infects and 7 regular damage. I that's fine. I'm not gonna Ghost Quarter the Inkmoth Nexus quite yet. So let's just take it, since we might need all the mana next turn. So let's just untap. Chromatic Star. That's decent. So let's run that out. So I'm not liking our chances if our opponent gets to untap here, so I think we just start sacrificing some stars and make white mana here. Find a Faith's Reward. Alright, so we might start sacrificing a few of our Terrarions. The problem, of course, is that we don't have a lot of mana to go with these 2 Faith's Rewards, so we can Ghost Quarter our own Citadel to go get a basic. Run out another Ghost Quarter, do that again, just to thin out the deck before we draw with our Terrarion. So let's sacrifice this. Make white and blue. Find a Reshape. Alright, so we can Reshape for 0, get a Lotus Bloom, which gives us the mana we need here. We can't Reshape for 4 here, so we can't get an Ironworks, so I think we just need to get a Lotus Bloom, and we can sacrifice a Citadel, which we can also get back with the Faith's Reward. So sacrifice this for blue, and cast a Faith's Reward. Get a bunch of stuff back. So we have 1 basic left in the deck, so let's Ghost Quarter ourselves again. Get the island. Sacrifice this for white. Find a Banefire. We could just Banefire one of the opponent's creatures. I think we Faith's Reward again here. So let's make red mana. And I think we Ghost Quarter our opponent as well here. And then Faith's Reward. Sacrifice this for white. Find a Reshape. Alright, so we can Reshape for an Ironworks, but then we don't have the red mana to Banefire our opponent here, and I don't think we have enough mana in general. But I think Reshaping for an Ironworks is fine here. So let's sack this for blue. So let's tap 1 Ghost Quarter, Reshape, keeping up 1 white in case we draw into a Faith's Reward. So let's get an Ironworks, sacrificing the Wellspring. Find a star. Alright, that's okay, that's a redraw. So get an Ironworks, sacrifice Terrarion, find a Bauble, run out the star. Can use this to make a red mana. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So we don't have enough mana to kill our opponent with this Banefire yet. Draw a card with the Conjurer's Bauble rather than making mana. Find another Ironworks. So I think we sacrifice this to get a last redraw. Hope to find a Faith's Reward. Wellspring is also a redraw. Alright, some more redraws. And I think we just have to sacrifice this for colorless in case we find a Faith's Reward. Find an Open the Vaults, which we don't have double white for. Alright, so I think we need to pass a turn here, so we can play out another Ironworks, and then we need to pass a turn and hope that we are not dead on this following turn. But if we do get to Open the Vaults, then we should be able to win the game. Although I guess we don't even have double white for Open the Vaults. Opponent with another Master of Ethereum, that's probably lethal. So it could be that we floated some mana incorrectly at some points, and that we could have kept up double white for Open the Vaults. So our opponent can attack us for a bunch here. I guess we should have responded with Ghost Quarter. We can Ghost Quarter one of the opponent's lands, but they can sacrifice it to the Ravager, so we should have maybe killed the Blinkmoth beforehand, before it became a creature, since now our opponent gets to eat it with the Ravager. But I think that still leaves us dead. Alright, so pretty close one here. Definitely not sure that I played that right. We could have tried to Banefire one of the opponent's creatures, but we kind of wanted to keep going for it. If our opponent didn't have this other master, I think we get another turn. So what would we have drawn? Another Ironworks, which would not have done it since we still didn't have double white for Open the Vaults. And there was the Faith's Reward, which was gonna win us the game if we drew it last turn. So yeah, I think if we had sacrificed the Chromatic Star with its own ability in the end there, and made white mana rather than sacrificing the star to the Ironworks, we would have had the 2 mana to give us the out of Open the Vaults, rather than just relying on drawing the Faith's Reward. So things can get pretty complicated, as you could see here, especially when the opponent has some disruption and you're not simply gold fishing. So I wanna thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed, and as always, have a nice day. I also want to thank all my patrons for supporting the channel, and you can do so yourself as well over at patreon.com/LegenVD, where you get cool rewards for supporting the channel, as well as getting us closer to our goals, where with every goal reached we will release an additional weekly series. So if you want to see more content, Patreon is the place to go.